Hi, I'm Caleb Mink, and this is Burn Baby Burn, Why Socialism Won't Work in Our American Society. I believe in a society where all people do well, not just a handful of billionaires. Bernie Sanders is a United States Senator from Vermont and a socialist, and also is one of the leading members of the Democratic Party. He believes that the capitalistic system that has made America one of the wealthiest countries of the New World has failed. With the top 1% owning the majority of the wealth in the country, he believes that there's only one solution to this economic crisis: socialism. Over the last couple years, young Americans have blindly praised socialism for its promises of universal health care, free college, and income equality. What these people fail to acknowledge is the authoritarianism in China, or the starving masses in Venezuela, or even the fact that the term Nazi, unabbreviated, stands for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Americans must face the hard truth that socialism will not help our country thrive, but will rather destroy the truths and values our founders sought to protect. Due to the insufficient evidence to show a true socialistic system would work long term, Americans must turn away from the policies that will fail to create both a safe and fair economy, even with the checks and balances instituted by the Constitution. In this speech, first, I will define what socialism actually means versus what people today think it means. Then, I will go over a few historical examples of how socialism has failed to achieve what it sets out to accomplish, both economically and politically. And finally, I will then discuss why socialism won't work in our American society and why our Constitution does not support this economic system. Even with all the hype surrounding socialism and its promises of an economically fair society, very few people advocating for it actually know how to define it. When the vast majority of the population hears the word socialism, immediately declarations of healthcare for every senior captures their thoughts, and free college for every student entices their minds. Yet when asked to define socialism, they seem completely unaware of the true nature of it or how it actually works. While some define socialism as income equality, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it as a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. Socialism makes the assumption that people can and will work together for the collective good of the people, or rather the collective good of the state. With this principle in mind, socialism means that the government owns the means of production. That means oil, railroads, mines, energy production, all things that are typically privately owned in capitalism. Notably, socialism also seeks to abolish private property, turning any private ownership into public ownership, thus handing all ownership over to the state. Another important term to define, especially within our American society, is social democracy. Many politicians who push socialist agendas call themselves social democrats in an attempt to water down what are often considered extreme ideals. However, upon further inspection, it becomes clear social democrats still desire a state-owned, or at least something close to, a state-owned industry. Again, referring to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, social democracy is defined as a political movement advocating for both a gradual and peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism by democratic means. Social democrats and socialists aren't that different. Socialism still remains the desired end goal. The only difference is how we get from point A to point B. Titles are irrelevant. Those who support socialism support the state-owned means of production and the eventual abolition of private property. Along with this, the majority of support for socialism comes from an audience that does not even understand their own beliefs. Roughly 60 years ago, nobody thought of socialism without thinking of the Iron Curtain in Russia or the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, today, young Americans have forgotten old truths and support socialism over capitalism. YouGov, a global public opinion and data company mainly focused on political survey, showed that 43% of respondents under the age of 30 had a favorable view of socialism. Only 32% had a favorable view of capitalism. Despite living in one of the most prosperous capitalistic nations in the history of the world, people still run to the empty promises of this economical concept. So the question has to be asked, why do people run to socialism as the answer for all their problems? The answer is quite simple. They don't know what socialism actually means. Gallup, in a 2016 poll, records 55% of millennials as supporting socialism. When asked to define it, however, Reason Foundation found that only 16% of millennials could identify socialism as a government ownership of the means of production. That's an 84% difference. George Santayana once said, "To know your future, you must know your past." However, when dealing with socialism, this old adage gets lost within a new postmodern truth. Young people praise socialism for being a warrior of equality, yet are completely unaware of the injustices caused by past socialist regimes. Knowing what socialism is as important as knowing why it fails. And one of the reasons it so often fails is because of the lack of incentives presented within a socialistic society. This not only causes economic decay, but also leads to a drastic decline in entrepreneurship. Incentives are what drive economic growth in America. After all, people want to increase their income. Who doesn't? And this is what drives Americans to go work harder, to increase their income and rise to the top of the economic ladder. While these trademarks of a capitalistic society promote incentives by encouraging a free market and a competitive atmosphere between businesses, socialism simply does the opposite. It destroys the drive of an economy. Mark J. Perry, a professor of economics and finance at the University of Michigan's Flint campus, puts it bluntly. Under socialism, incentives either play a minimal role or are totally ignored. A centrally planned economy without prices or profits, where property is owned by the state, is a system without an efficient incentive mechanism to direct economic activity. This country was founded on the principle of the American dream, and along with that, the belief that what you earn by right is yours to keep. If Americans are forced to work in a system that deliberately deprives them of their incentives, it leads to a discouraged workforce that is unwilling to put serious effort towards their work. A system without incentives also leads to less innovative thinkers and fewer entrepreneurs, as people lose their desire to come up with new ideas when the profits they earn are divvied up into the hands of people who had no part in the painstaking task of creating that business. Because of this, socialism strips the power right out of the hands of the people and gives it directly to the state. It becomes clear that you don't have proper incentives for society if you don't get to keep most of what you've earned, and that incentive diminishes the more the government takes. Without incentives, people aren't motivated and begin to lose sight of what the government's doing behind the scenes. The process of creating a society that no longer puts pride into their work is an essential step towards taking control. Socialistic governments practically twist the arm of their people, demanding that they work despite having no incentive to do so. Socialism not only fails to provide the proper incentives, but also destroys economies, thus lowering the standard of living for everyone. In order to get a better sense of what socialism does to a country, I interviewed Mark Champagne. Mark is a pastor of Redeemer Church and a tutor here at PEP Mason. From 1994 to 1996, Mark lived in Hungary, teaching English as a second language to Hungarian students. While there, he experienced the effects that socialism had left on the country, and during our time together, we discussed some of those experiences. While living in Hungary, Mr. Champagne was able to see the merit in privately owned companies, businesses, and homes, rather than a commie condo he stayed in while living there. He recounted his time there, saying, "I lived there for 2 years, the first year in what I refer to when talking to you as a commie condo. So in 1956, when the communists took over, they constructed a whole bunch of 10-story apartments that looked exactly the same. So my experience was living in one of those." He continued, "Nobody cared about what the building looked like or smelled like. I didn't observe anybody ever cleaning the place. I didn't have any sense that there was any private ownership. There was no upkeep. Along with this, the condo was unsafe for its tenants, as he recounted a story to me about how every time he went in the elevator, he didn't know if he'd make it to the top. While he did go on to say, while he didn't know who directly owned that building at the time, what he did observe was the kind of lack of care that comes along with not having direct ownership, or in contrast, just living in the United States of America in an apartment. It's not your own home. The narrower your private ownership becomes, the more you take care of something. The American privilege is something so many, so often take for granted. The ability to own something that is yours, to own something privately rather than have something possessed collectively. Many people believe that socialism puts the needs of the people first. Yet when one looks at the conditions of a place like where Mark stayed and where hundreds of others of people are staying in this day in countries like Venezuela, it becomes clear that while admirable, it is impossible to achieve what socialism sets out to accomplish. People who believe socialism and government can solve every frailty in society have an unrealistic view of the world. Despite the numerous claims that socialism can fix every American problem, the perfect utopian society often depicted by socialists cannot work in our cursed, broken, and imperfect world. Throughout the ages, people have tried to find worldly solutions to come up and create a perfect world. However, when you look at the nature of man, it becomes evident that while admirable, perfection of any kind, including what socialism sets out to accomplish, is impossible. Socialists believe that people are inherently good and that they can work together collectively despite our inherent sin nature. Sadly, in reality, people are always self-motivated and unwilling to work together without the proper benefits. Americans must realize that the choice of economic institutions is a crucial in an imperfect universe with imperfect beings and limited resources. In a world of scarcity, it is essential for an economic system to be based on clear incentive structure to promote economic efficiency. In a perfect world, one with no conflict of interests, perfect people and unlimited resources, sure, I'll admit it. Socialism would in fact work as an economic system, but so would capitalism. So would any system, because perfection is perfection. However, we know that the world is not a place of perfection. The world is a place where people are inherently wicked. The world is a place where governments often take advantage of their people. The world is a place where evil thrives and goodness is often overlooked. Socialism ignores the reality of the world and it fails to acknowledge its corrupt nature, that is, everyone's inherent sin nature. The key difference between capitalism and socialism is that capitalism harnesses the greatest good drive. Socialism simply pretends it doesn't exist. Socialism at its very basis makes a false assumption regarding human nature, and it thinks that people can work together for the common good. This assumption is false. Turn on the evening news. Murders, gang violence, school shootings. These problems do not point to a cooperative, inherently good human nature, but rather one that is broken, bent, driven by both greed and selfishness. Ignoring the inherent sin nature of man is not a good starting block for building a sound economic system, and it may be one of the reasons why it so often fails. When looking at socialism through a biblical lens, it becomes clear that it cannot work simply because it ignores this fact. Right after the flood, Noah burned an offering for the Lord in Genesis. And quote, "When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, God said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth." Despite what socialists may believe, the wicked hearts of men have been a part of creation ever since Adam ate that apple. And if every intention of man's heart is in fact stained, then how can we expect to create a perfect stainless society built by the hands of us, broken men and women? Even while most socialists may have admirable aims to create a more equal society, when looking at the Bible, it becomes clear that sometimes even the most commendable intentions can lead to catastrophe. Referring to Romans 7:21, so I find it to be law that when I do want to do right, evil lies close at hand. Even with the best intentions at heart, wickedness still remains. Now at this point, I want to clarify something. I'm not saying by advocating for socialism or being a socialist means that you're simply going against the teachings of God. That would be incredibly arrogant of me. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room knows, and everyone at home watching, that there is no Bible verse that says, "Thou shalt be capitalist," and socialism is of the devil. No, that's not a Bible verse. However, what the Bible is perfectly clear on is the bent and broken nature of man. And the fact that socialism ignores this should at least be raising some warning flags in our minds. America is a nation built on the principle that God is real and has endowed his creation with certain inalienable rights. So how can we vote for a system that ignores these biblical principles? Perhaps one of the reasons socialism fails is because it fails to deliver on the promises it makes, is because of this false view of the world. In stark contrast to Venezuela, Scandinavians' economic success comes not from the socialistic controlled means of production, but rather the free market and privately owned businesses of capitalism. For a long time, people have confused having a socialist economy with having a mixed economy. Mixed economy meaning that countries that have certain aspects of different economic systems. While people like Bernie Sanders point towards Scandinavia as his example for what socialism should look like, upon further inspection, most of their policies actually advocate for a capitalist society. As far as private ownership goes, Gina Carlo, a strategic communications consultant, reports that even using Thomas Piketty's World Inequality Report, 90% of Scandinavia's combined wealth is privately owned. In a lot of ways, the Scandinavian model is a lot like the American model. Both are, to a certain degree, mixed economies that rely heavily on privatized businesses. So, when American socialists brag about Scandinavian democratic socialism, someone needs to ask, is Scandinavia really socialist at all? Indeed, without having government owning the means of production, nor having collectively owned profits, Scandinavia is more capitalistic than it is socialistic. The Constitution does not allow for a system of economics where the leaders of the government have more power than the people. Written in the earliest days of our founders' development, the Constitution lays out the guidelines for how our government should work. One of the sole purposes of the document is to ensure that the people have more power than the government. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and our founders put these checks and balances in place to defend America from tyranny. While the U.S. Constitution may as a technical matter be silent on most economic questions, it is crystal clear on the appropriate role of government, and the government that it permits is incompatible with and insufficient to sustain socialism. Socialism gives the government practically unrestricted power at the wealth of an entire nation. Our founders put these checks and balances in the Constitution to ensure that the government does not take control. And if they didn't, what was the point of spilling all that tea in Boston? By instituting socialism, we, the people, would hand our rights directly over to the authorities. When we vote for politicians, we expect that person to follow the law. Now, it doesn't always happen that way, but that's at least what we expect. Socialism's incompatibility with the Constitution does not matter to voters, as they're all eager to get free college from Bernie. Democratic act seems all but lost upon the public. As in the West, choosing to trade with a person in another country is itself a democratic act. Electing to start a company in your garage with no need for another's permission is itself a democratic act. When the government steps in with their bayonets and says no, they're effectively keeping your choices off the ballot. In this world, money is kind of important. When you say? In case you didn't pick up on my sarcasm, it is. Money makes this fallen world go round. And if the government is put in a position of power where they can control more wealth and power than they already do, then it clearly goes against what the founders meant for and instituted in the Constitution. The checks and balances within this document cannot work if we the people throw away the truths written within it. While I'll admit, it is true that the capitalistic system we have right now does have major flaws. That does not mean Americans should turn to socialism as their solution for economic equality. It may also be true that the top 1% does own the majority of the wealth in the country. But this does not mean socialism is the answer to inequality of any kind. The U.S. does a poor job relative to some terms of the social safety net. However, everyone needs to realize that we can make a lot of change without getting rid of the whole system, and neither side should be afraid of change. While capitalism certainly has its flaws, America cannot abandon the system that has made and continues to make it one of the wealthiest countries of the world. I realize that people around the world, and in America specifically, are hurting. Some families are having trouble making rent. Some businesses are focused solely on profit and care very little about who they are affecting by their greed. No matter how we go about our economics, there will always be some hardship. There will be some pain. There will be some corruption. This does not mean we should jump ship and turn to a system that continuously makes life worse for everyone. The reason systems fail is because people fail. We have to find other ways to help people, rather than, in a moment of desperation, turn to a system that makes life worse for everybody. So, with everything I said, what do we do? With all the different views out there, it can be hard to come to a solid conclusion on who or what you should believe in. Well, one of the great things about being an American is we get to make our own choices. We can choose what we believe, come to our own conclusions. And sometimes others might not agree with us, but that's okay. The best advice I can give you is this: be educated voters. Know what you believe. Make your choice not by what Hannity tells you on Fox or what Bernie says on CNN. No, come to your own conclusion. Make your own choice. You have a right and an obligation to vote, so use it. And hey, after everything I've said today, if you still disagree with me, that's fine. Maybe someday we can talk about it in the breadlines. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. A few questions for you. You talk about how people look at socialism for its promises equality, but what equality specifically?
Equality in the sense that socialists typically, especially Bernie Sanders, advocates that the top 1% is so much different than the bottom middle class, because he owns, and the 1% owns all the wealth in the country, and that's the kind of inequality they're talking about, just the wealth difference between the 1% and then the middle class. They believe that that should all be shared between everybody, and yeah.
Thank you. How would you go about convincing the poverty-stricken people of America who would most benefit from socialism that socialism is a negative rather than a positive for them?
I would say that I realize that there is some pain. There is obviously some hardship in this world. But what I don't think they realize is that socialism, while they may have it bad now, and obviously I don't know to what extent this person is trying to say, but under socialism, it makes life worse for everyone. It's not just the middle class, it's not just the upper class, but it's also the lower class. Because if we look to somewhere like Venezuela, people are starving. In America, that doesn't typically happen. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but still the majority of the people have something on their plate. And I think that's the main difference between capitalism and socialism. So.
Thank you. Next question. What exactly is the difference between socialism and communism?
Okay, so socialism is the economic side of communism. Communism is both a political institution and an economic institution. So one of the main differences, obviously, in a communism is that they have like a dictator kind of sort of head. Now, socialism is obviously just the economic side of that. However, I would argue that still, by instituting socialism, it still leads to corruption and seeps in that it's a pathway. If I go back to what I defined as social democracy, it's a gradual shift from capitalism to socialism. And what I think that means is shifting towards that kind of authoritarianistic viewpoint, that what we see in China and Venezuela right now. So,
thank you. Another question. Do you think that the Bible addresses this in the 8th commandment, quote, "You shall not steal," which gives a presupposition of personal ownership and property?
Do I think the 8th commandment addresses this? I think we can take biblical truths from the 8th commandment there. Now, again, like I said earlier, I'm not saying that the Bible in any way, shape, or form advocates for any political system or any economic system. What I am saying is that we can use our biblical worldview and our biblical lens to kind of look at these problems and address them. So while I'm not sure about a direct correlation, I do think we can use biblical truth and evaluate this.
Thank you. Another question. Do you think that striving to create a perfect utopia will always lead to a problematic government system?
Yes, especially with socialism, because they come from a viewpoint that assumes that people are inherently good. And I think whenever you do that, it always comes back to you have something that's missing. Because when you assume that people are good, you kind of realize later down the line that they're not. And when that happens, gaps begin to open up, and then obviously authoritarianism seeps in, and then corruption and poverty And then people were asking the same questions that they asked at the beginning. Why are we hurting? Why is there inequality? It's just a nasty circle that people always get back to.
Last question. Since socialism puts people in harmful conditions, the church has a responsibility to advocate against it. What do you see as the church's role in accomplishing this?
Personally, I do not think the church should advocate for any economic system, simply because like I said earlier, there's no Bible verse that says, thou shalt be capitalists and not socialism, and not socialists. Because I would argue that a lot of people are hurting from capitalism as well. And if we have that kind of mindset, then why not go against capitalism? We have to make do with what we have in this broken world. And I think one of the reasons we should stick with capitalism is because it harnesses that greed is good drive. The only reason I would say that as Christians we should look at socialism differently is simply because they are trying to create a perfect utopian society that can't work in this world. And that's what I was kind of addressing.
Thank you, Caleb.